Hello, friends. Thank you for being with me. Subscribe, like, and let's get started.
Ethan Carter was sitting at the dining table, idly picking at a plate of pasta with a fork, but his attention was focused on the notifications on his phone. His wife, Madison, was often late at work, especially in recent weeks. The sound of the keys turning in the lock made him look up. He heard the click of heels on the wooden floor and a short but nervous sigh. Madison entered the kitchen, closing the door slightly behind her, as if she wanted to restrict herself from the rest of the house. She had a bag in her hands, the strap of which she was nervously fiddling with. "You're late," Ethan said, glancing at his watch, but there was no condemnation or surprise in his voice. Rather, fatigue, tinged with a tinge of irritation. "Yes," she replied without looking up. Instead of putting the bag on the shelf, as she always did, she just left it on the nearest chair and stood at the edge of the table. Ethan looked at her more closely. There was something in her face that he hadn't seen before. Seriousness? Whine? Regret? Has something happened? "What is it?" he asked, feeling an unpleasant feeling begin to form inside. Madison took a deep breath, her shoulders shaking slightly as she exhaled. "We need to talk," she finally said. Her voice was low, but it broke the silence like a bolt from the blue. Ethan put down his fork, his fingers clenched into a fist. The words, "we need to talk," never bode well. "About what?" he asked, trying to remain calm, but there was a note of caution in his voice, like a man who intuitively anticipates trouble. Madison looked down, gripping the strap of her bag again, as if it could give her support. She was silent for several long seconds before saying, "This Friday, I'm going on a date." Tom seemed to have stopped. Ethan stared at her, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. "On a date? Is this some kind of joke?" He studied her face, trying to find a hint of embarrassed laughter there, but found only seriousness. "I'm sorry, what? What is it?" he asked, his voice strangely flat, as if he refused to take it seriously. Madison swallowed, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'm going on a date with a colleague, Blake Anderson," she said. Her voice was almost emotionless, as if she had learned these words in advance. For a moment, Ethan felt the ground give way beneath his feet. He pushed back in his chair, his gaze darted to the side, and then returned to her. "Are you serious about this?" His voice was no longer calm. There was a mixture of shock and growing anger in him. Madison nodded, her eyes moistened, but she blinked quickly, as if she didn't want to show weakness. "Is this some kind of test?" He continued, his voice sounding puzzled. "You're going on a date because—" "Why? You're married, Madison. Do you remember that?" She looked up, and Ethan saw something in her gaze that he hadn't expected to see: pain and determination. "It's not about us," she finally said. "It's about me. I feel like I'm suffocating, that I don't know who I am anymore." Ethan abruptly stood up from the table, the chair creaking on the floor. He was standing in front of her, his heart beating so fast that he could feel the blood pulsing in his temples. "Are you suffocating? You? And you think a date with some Blake is going to help you figure it out?" His voice was loud, but there was not only anger in it, but also wounded bewilderment. Madison took a step back, her fingers gripping the strap even tighter. "I'm not looking for excuses, Ethan," she said softly. "I just can't go on like this. I need to figure out what I want." Ethan felt anger cloud his mind. He came closer, looming over her, but immediately stopped, taking a deep breath. "Do you want to understand what you want? What about me? About us? Did you just decide to take a break from your marriage and go have fun?" Her lips twitched, but she didn't back down. "I want to be honest. I thought you deserved to know." Ethan chuckled, but there was no joy in his laughter. "Oh, thank you. Truth. This is true." He grabbed the plate from the table and abruptly put it in the sink, too hard so that it almost cracked. Madison stood motionless, her face frozen in a mask of restraint, but her hands were shaking. "I'm not asking for your permission, Ethan. I ask for your understanding," she finally said, but her voice sounded strained. Ethan turned away from her, bracing his hands on the edge of the sink. His breathing was heavy, and a volcano of emotions was boiling in his chest. "You do understand what you're saying now, don't you?" he said at last without turning around. "You're telling me that our marriage means nothing to you, that you're willing to throw everything away for someone. An experiment?" Madison took a step forward, but stopped, as if an invisible wall had appeared between them. "It's not that easy, Ethan," she whispered. He turned abruptly, his eyes flashing with anger. "Oh, that's easy enough, Madison. You're destroying everything. With your own hands." She didn't answer, just stood there, looking down. They were silent for several long seconds, and then Ethan, holding back the rush of emotions, stepped past her to the door. "I need to get out," he said shortly, and without waiting for her answer, slammed the door. Madison was left alone in the kitchen. She slowly sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking, but she did not allow herself to cry. Instead, she sat in silence, watching the shadows playing on the wall, as if searching them for the answer to her most difficult question: what to do next. Night enveloped the Carter house, but sleep did not come. Ethan was lying on his side of the bed, with his back to Madison. Her breathing was even, quiet, like a person whose conscience is clear or who is just too tired to think about the consequences. But Ethan knew that wasn't the case. Her words, her behavior, all of it left his mind on the verge of exploding. Madison was lying next to her, her body turned slightly, and the bed creaked under her. He froze, listening, but her breathing remained calm. She was asleep. This was his chance. Her phone was on the bedside table, illuminated by the faint light coming from the screen. Ethan slowly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. Every step, every little thing seemed crucial now. Coming to her side, he held out his hand, stopped for a second, looking at her face. She didn't move. He took the phone. The phone was locked, but Ethan knew her password. Years of living together have taught him to pay attention to such details, even if he never thought it would be useful before. Entering the combination, he felt a slight twinge of guilt, but immediately suppressed it. It was necessary. He opened the list of messages. It was all there. The exchange of short, seemingly harmless jokes, late-night conversations, photos. Blake Anderson's name flashed over and over again. The first few messages seemed just friendly to him, but the further he scrolled through the correspondence, the heavier his breathing became. "I miss you." This phrase stood apart like a trap. Madison sent it 2 days ago. Ethan froze. His eyes darted across the screen, checking to see if he had made a mistake after all. Maybe it was the wrong context. But everything pointed to the opposite. "I hope Friday turns out the way we planned," Blake replied, adding a winking smiley face. Ethan's gaze jumped from line to line. Each new piece of text seemed like another blow to the chest. "This dress suits you. I can't wait to see you in it again," Blake wrote a week ago. "You make me feel alive," Madison replied to him. The phone in Ethan's hands almost slipped out, his fingers were shaking. He closed his eyes, trying to suppress the rising tide of anger. "It's not just a date, it's not just a self-test," as she tried to explain. "This is a full-fledged betrayal, carefully hidden behind a mask of normality." Fragments of memories flashed through his mind. Their wedding, her smile, their conversations about the future, plans that seemed so real. It was all shattering now. He went deeper, opening the photos. There were mundane pictures, coffee on the desktop, empty office corridors, but then he found a picture of Blake holding her hand. The smile on her face was sincere. Her eyes were shining. This sincerity stung like a knife. The phone began to vibrate in his hands. A notification appeared on the screen, a message from Blake. Ethan's heart began to pound harder. He quickly opened it. "I can't wait for Friday. I have everything ready. Do you want a hint of what awaits you?" Ethan gritted his teeth, his fingers instinctively clenched around the phone. He closed the message, slowly put the phone back on her bedside table, and returned to his side of the bed. Madison continued to sleep, unaware that her little world was beginning to crumble. Ethan stared at the ceiling, his breathing heavy, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to scream, wanted to wake her up right now, and demand an explanation. But something stopped him. He pulled himself together, his anger turned cold. On Friday night, Madison stood in front of the bedroom mirror, fastening her earrings and straightening her hair. Her hands were trembling slightly, although she tried to hide it behind a familiar ritual. The black dress fit perfectly, but it seemed to her that it screamed her intentions louder than she would ever have dared. Ethan was drinking coffee in the kitchen, listening intently to her every step upstairs. He didn't say anything to her when she came downstairs, but a look of silent rage followed her all the way to the door. "Don't come back late," he snapped before she could say anything. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't stop. Closing the door behind her, she went to the car. The restaurant was noisy but cozy, with soft candlelight and light music. Blake was already waiting for her at a table in the corner. His smile was wide and friendly, but there was something subtly indifferent about it. He was wearing an expensive jacket, and his confidence was immediately evident. "You look amazing," he said, getting up to pull out a chair for her. Madison smiled, but her smile was forced. "Thank you, Blake." "You too," she replied, sitting down. The conversation started easily, but the longer they talked, the more she felt that something was wrong. His jokes, which previously seemed witty, sounded superficial. His compliments did not warm, but on the contrary, created awkwardness. Madison felt like she was watching herself from the sidelines. Her thoughts were torn between the present and what she had left at home. She saw Ethan's face, his anger and pain, saw how he was silently crushed this evening. When the food arrived, she barely touched her plate. Blake was saying something, waving his arms, but her mind was floating far away. She felt like a stranger in this restaurant, in this conversation, in this dress. "Madison, are you listening to me?" Blake finally asked, frowning. She blinked back to reality. "I'm sorry, I was thinking," she replied, lowering her gaze. He nodded, but his face became more distant. He tried to revive the conversation, but something broke. Madison nodded politely, but guilt was bubbling inside her. When dinner came to an end and Blake suggested a walk, she gently declined. "I think I need to go home," she said, avoiding his gaze. He didn't object, but his smile wasn't so confident anymore. "If you want to repeat it, let me know," he said, walking her to her car. She nodded, but she already knew that this would never happen. On the way back, her head was spinning with thoughts. She kept thinking about Ethan, his face, his words. She was thinking that betrayal is not just a physical act. It was a blow to the very heart of their marriage, and she had struck it herself. The house door opened softly, as if Madison wanted to avoid any sound that might break the fragile silence. The light in the living room was on, and she saw the silhouette of Ethan sitting in an armchair in front of the TV. He didn't turn around, but he heard her footsteps. He called over his shoulder without taking his eyes off the screen. His voice was cold, like a tightrope that was about to break. Madison paused for a moment at the threshold, her hand still gripping the door handle. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I came back," she finally said. Her voice was low, but there was a tremor in it. Ethan grinned, but didn't turn around. "I see it. So the hotel was occupied? Or what?" His words were laced with sarcasm and bitterness. She came closer, her steps hesitant, as if she was walking on fragile ice. "I didn't go to the hotel," she said, stopping behind his chair. "Blake offered, but I refused." Ethan finally turned around, his eyes filled with anger and pain. "And you think that makes a difference?" "What is it?" he asked, his voice harsh. "You went on this date anyway, Madison. You ruined it anyway." "I know," she interrupted, her voice suddenly getting louder, even though it was shaking. "I know, Ethan. I understand what I did, and I'm not trying to justify it." He stood up from his chair, turning to face her. There was no furniture between them now, no distance, just naked tension. "Then why are you here?" "What is it?" he asked, looking her straight in the eye. "Why did you come back?" She took a step forward, her eyes filled with tears. "Because I realized that I didn't want it. I don't want anyone but you, Ethan. I thought I could find something that I was missing, but all I found was the feeling that I was losing you. I'm losing us." He was silent, his hands clenched into fists. She continued, her words steeped in sincerity. "I'm sorry, Ethan. It's a real pity. I was wrong, and if I could change everything, I would do it. But I can't. I can only ask you, forgive me." Ethan stared at her for a long time, his gaze heavy, as if he was trying to figure out whether to believe her or not. Her face was sincere. Tears were rolling down her cheeks, but she didn't try to wipe them away. She just stood in front of him, waiting for an answer. "I'm sorry?" he finally said, his voice quieter, but there was still bitterness in it. "Do you think it's that simple?" Madison shook her head, her voice trembling again. No, there is nothing simple about it. But I'm willing to do anything to at least give me a chance. Ethan was silent, his breathing heavy. Finally, he sat back down in the chair with his head in his hands. I do not know, Madison, he said softly. I just don't know. She knelt down next to the chair, putting her hand on his shoulder. I'm ready to wait. I'm ready to prove that everything we had can still be. If you let me. Ethan slowly raised his head, his gaze softened, but he still remained wary. It's not going to happen overnight, he said. Madison nodded. I understand, but I'll stay if you let me. He closed his eyes as if he was struggling with himself, but said nothing more. Silence filled the room again, but now there was a shadow of hope in it that both of them were afraid to destroy. Early in the morning, Ethan Carter was sitting at the kitchen table, drumming his fingers on the table. His gaze was focused on the phone lying next to him. Notifications flashed on the screen. Work correspondence, some banal updates. But that wasn't what he was worried about right now. Thoughts were spinning in his head that burned like a red-hot coal. Madison walked into the kitchen with the air of a person trying to pretend normality. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a strained smile on her face. She looked into his cup, as if that might be an excuse to talk. Do you want me to make you some fresh coffee? She offered cautiously, her voice low, almost conciliatory. Ethan looked up, holding her gaze a little longer than usual. He could feel the tension in her manner, like a child awaiting punishment. No, thank you, he replied coldly. His voice was even, but there were hints of inflexibility in it. We need to talk. The words he said seemed to pierce the air between them. Madison froze, holding the mug in her hands, and slowly put it down on the table. About what? What is it? She asked cautiously, her eyes quickly sliding to the door, as if she was considering the possibility of escape. About us, Ethan said, locking his fingers and leaning forward. About how we're going to move on. Do you want to save our marriage? Her face paled slightly, but she nodded quickly. Of course I want to. Then let's start with the rules, he said, and the words sounded like a shot. Madison hadn't expected to hear that. She blinked several times, as if trying to make sense of what she had said. Rules? What is it? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes. If we're going to fix this, you have to show me that I can trust you again. This means that from now on, everything will be transparent. No secrets, no innuendos. Madison carefully sat down on the chair opposite him, her hands folded in her lap, like a student in front of a strict teacher. Okay, she began, her voice full of doubt. What exactly are the rules? Ethan leaned forward, his eyes shining with a strange mixture of pain and determination. The first one, you're going to tell me where you're going and who you're meeting. Always. If you're late, I need to know the reason. There are no exceptions. She nodded, her face a silent mask. Second, he continued, I need access to your phone. No blocked apps, no deleted messages. Madison tensed slightly, her hands twitched slightly, but she quickly pulled herself together. Ethan, she began, but he interrupted her. It's necessary. If you want to regain my trust, this is what you need. She looked down, her fingers nervously clutching the hem of her shirt. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely audible. And third, his tone became even more harsh. You have to put our marriage first. No, I'm tired. No excuses. If I feel you pulling away again, that's it. Madison was silent. There was a tension in the air, so thick that it seemed you could touch it. Do you agree? What is it? He finally asked, his voice cold and unyielding. She looked up, and there was something in her gaze that he hadn't expected to see, a drop of fear. Yes, she replied, her voice trembling, but she tried to hide it. Ethan nodded. He felt like he was in control of the situation, but something inside was still restless. The following days passed in a strange silence. Madison tried to avoid talking, but did everything he asked. She sent him messages about where she was, and she always answered the phone. She even showed him her phone without saying a word. Ethan, in turn, was watching intently. Her every gesture, her every look seemed to him to be filled with hidden meaning. He was looking for signs. Maybe she was still lying. Maybe she was playing a game. One evening, he noticed her sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. Her face seemed calm, but her fingers were tapping nervously on the screen. "Who are you corresponding with?" "What is it?" he asked abruptly, entering the room. Madison flinched. The phone fell out of her hands and fell to the floor. "It's just a friend," she quickly replied, picking up the phone. "Show me." His voice was adamant. She slowly handed him the phone. Ethan flipped through the messages, but there really was only correspondence with her friend. Nevertheless, he felt her nervousness making him doubt. "Okay," he said, handing the phone back to her. "But remember, Madison, I can see everything." "All." She nodded, but her face was pale, like a man who had been cornered. Every day her smile became more and more rare, her movements cautious, as if she was afraid of hitting something invisible. She began to speak less, her voice sounded quieter. Ethan noticed it, but he didn't stop. He believed that it was necessary to restore their marriage. Madison was sitting cross-legged on the couch in the dark of the living room. Moonlight filtered through the half-closed blinds, drawing bizarre patterns on the walls. She was holding a mug of cold tea in her hands, but she didn't even try to take a sip. The evening silence was broken only by the ticking of the clock. Ethan was somewhere upstairs in his office, but she didn't care anymore. She felt an invisible weight settling on her shoulders, holding her breath. In recent weeks, her life has turned into a chain of commands, excuses, and fear of doing something wrong. She was no longer Madison, a woman with dreams, plans, and a life of her own. Now she has become someone's shadow, driven by fear and attempts to please. Her gaze fell on the suitcase hidden in the corner of the room. He was almost ready. Things lay in neat piles, only the most necessary. The decision to leave had been maturing in her for a long time, but today it became final. She couldn't take it anymore. I didn't want it anymore. Ethan was sitting at his desk in the office, his head in his hands. There was a laptop in front of him, the screen of which was blinking with a suggestion to save the document. But work was the last thing he could think about. His thoughts were focused on Madison. She's changed. Quiet, obedient, as if it wasn't her voice that sounded when she answered his questions. It bothered him strangely. It seemed to him that he was doing everything right. He set the rules to restore order in their relationship, to regain trust. But why does he feel that their house has become cold? Why, despite her agreeing to his demands, does he not feel satisfied? When he went down to the living room, he saw her silhouette on the sofa. She didn't even raise her head, only slightly averted her gaze when he came closer. "Are you sitting in the dark again?" His voice sounded slightly annoyed, but there was a sense of weariness deep down. "It's better for me," she replied shortly. Ethan walked over to the bar, poured himself a whiskey, and sat down in the chair across from her. He studied her face, trying to figure out what she was thinking. But her eyes stared at nothing, as if he were just a silhouette against the background. "I'm trying, Madison," he said, taking a sip. "Do you understand that? It's all for us." She slowly turned her head, and for the first time in a long time, an emotion appeared in her gaze, not fear, not fatigue, but something closer to determination. "For us?" Her voice was quiet, but there was an amazing calmness in it. "Are you sure this is all for us?" Ethan frowned and put the glass down on the table next to him. "Of course. Everything I do is so that we can move on." Madison shook her head, looking down. "Move on? We're stuck, Ethan. I'm stuck. I lost myself." His face darkened. "What do you mean by that?" She put the cup down on the coffee table and slowly stood up. "I can't live like this anymore. You have to understand that. I tried, but it doesn't work anymore." Ethan stood up too, his voice getting louder. "Do you want to give up everything? Again? After everything?" Her voice remained calm, although her hands were shaking slightly. "It's the only way out." He stepped closer, almost looming over her. "Do you think that just leaving is the solution? Do you think this will fix everything?" Madison didn't back down, although her gaze became even firmer. "Leaving is not what I want, but staying here is something I can no longer afford." There was a moment of tense silence in the room. Only the ticking of the clock filled the space. "And where are you going?" "What is it?" he asked with a challenge in his voice. "Do you think it will be better there?" She looked at him, her gaze full of bitterness and sadness. "I don't care if it's better or worse. The main thing is different." The suitcase was at the door when Ethan returned from the office. His heart sank when he saw her in her jacket, with the keys in her hands. "You're really doing this," he said softly. Madison nodded. "I'll leave the keys later. I just want to leave now." He took a step towards her, but did not stop her. His hand froze, not touching her shoulder. "Why? Why can't you give it a chance?" She turned around, her eyes glistening with tears. "I've given this too many chances, Ethan. But you don't see it, and maybe you'll never see it." Her words were like a slap in the face, but he didn't respond. She opened the door, took a step over the threshold, and, turning around, quietly added, "Goodbye, Ethan." The door closed, leaving him alone. The house was filled with an echoing silence. He slowly sank onto the sofa, feeling the walls seem to narrow around him. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter woke up in absolute silence. He didn't have to listen to the sound of Madison's footsteps in the kitchen or her voice chatting with her friends on the phone. All of this disappeared with her, leaving only a void that was impossible to ignore. He got out of bed, heavy sleep still hanging on his shoulders. Going down to the kitchen, he brewed coffee on the machine without even thinking about why he made 2 cups at once. It was only when the floating mug remained untouched on the table that he realized his mistake. She always drank the second cup. Ethan set her aside and sat down at the table, looking out the window. For the first time in months, his mind was quiet, but the silence was oppressive. It seemed to be asking the same question: what's next? In the afternoon, he decided to leave the house in order to somehow get rid of this feeling of isolation. He got into the car and headed towards the city center. His gaze darted around the streets where they had once walked together. Each corner had its own little memory. The cafe where they had breakfast on Sundays, the store where Madison insisted on buying that ridiculous vase. It all seemed like a part of someone else's life now. At some point, his car stopped at a building that he noticed only out of the corner of his eye. The sign read, Center for Psychotherapy and Recovery. He held his gaze, not knowing what exactly made him stop. But before he could think about it, his hand reached for the car door, and he was on the sidewalk. It was quiet and cozy inside. The young woman behind the counter smiled at him, but her gaze was attentive, as if she saw what brought him here. "Would you like to make an appointment?" "What is it?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded, feeling a little awkward. "Yes, maybe I need it," he replied. The first session was awkward. The therapist, a woman in her late 40s with short dark hair, introduced herself as Dr. Rachel Goodman. Her voice was calm and encouraging, but Ethan felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether to jump. "Why did you decide to come?" she asked at the very beginning. Ethan hesitated before answering. "My wife left, and I think it's my fault." Rachel nodded, making notes on her notebook. "Let's start with what's bothering you the most right now." He was silent for a long time, but then he started talking. The words poured out of his mouth as he described the last months of their marriage. Her betrayal, his revenge, their growing estrangement. He talked, and she listened, sometimes asking questions that made him think deeper. By the end of the first session, he felt exhausted, but for the first time in a long time, his thoughts began to take on at least some order. Weeks passed. Ethan began to attend therapy regularly. Gradually, he began to realize that his anger and desire for control were not just a reaction to betrayal. They were a reflection of his own fear. Fear of loss, fear of loneliness, fear of admitting that he himself was part of this problem. Rachel helped him sort out these fears step by step. She forced him to look at himself from the outside, to see not only Madison's mistakes, but also his own. It was painful, but necessary. "You can't fix the past," she once said, "but you can understand it. And only then move on." Over time, the house stopped feeling so empty. He filled it with new habits, new sounds. Music was playing from the speakers. Books were lying on the table. Once he even caught himself smiling while reading something on the internet. It was strange, but pleasant. One evening turned out to be particularly quiet. Ethan Carter was sitting at his desk in the living room, surrounded by papers and a laptop. Work became his salvation, a means of distraction, a way to drown out the silence that still sometimes enveloped the house. He was flipping through reports, writing down ideas, when there was a soft knock on the door. Ethan raised his head. He wasn't expecting anyone at this time. Going to the door, he carefully opened it. A courier stood on the threshold with a small envelope in his hands. "For you, Mr. Carter," he said with a professional smile, holding out the package. Ethan took the envelope, nodding to the courier. After waiting for the car to drive away, he closed the door and looked at the sender's name. His heart skipped a beat. Madison Carter. He sat back down at the table, holding the envelope in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, as if this letter was not just paper, but weighed a ton. He just stared at it for a few minutes, not daring to open it. Finally, with a sigh, he carefully tore open the edge and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The lines were written in her handwriting, a little uneven, but still confident. Ethan began to read. "Ethan, I've been thinking for a long time whether I should write to you. But months after our last conversation, I realized that the words I have to say are too important to remain unsaid. First of all, I want to apologize. Not just for what I did, although I know that I destroyed a lot of what we were building. I want to apologize for not being honest enough. With you, with myself, with our relationship. I got bogged down in my lack of freedom, and instead of fighting for us, I chose a path that was selfish. You deserve more. But I also want to thank you for the years that we spent together, for the moments that I will always keep in my heart, for your strength, for the love you gave me even when I didn't deserve it. I understand this now more than ever. After I left, I had to face myself. It wasn't easy, but I think it was only because of this that I was able to see what I had done wrong. And I hope that you also found what you were looking for, if not in us, then in yourself. I'm not writing this letter to ask you to come back or to fix something. This letter is my attempt to put an end to it and allow us both to move forward. Thanks for everything, Ethan. For love, for the lessons, for the moments that I will always remember. Love, Madison." Ethan put the letter on the table, leaning on the back of a chair. He closed his eyes, feeling something change inside him. It was like a sudden gust of wind that brings not only coolness, but also purification. He read the letter again, more slowly this time, delving into every line. It wasn't just words. It was a confession, forgiveness, gratitude, everything he wanted to hear but never asked for. The next day, Ethan went to the park near the house. Sitting on the bench, he reflected on how things had turned out. He remembered their early years of marriage, their laughter, their dreams. It all seemed like a distant, but not painful part of his life now. People were passing by, children were playing on the playground, and he was sitting holding a letter in his hands. It no longer felt heavy. It was light, like a memory that doesn't hurt anymore. Ethan didn't write back. He realized that he didn't need to. He got up from the bench, feeling that for the first time in a long time, he was really ready to let go. This letter became the point that gave him the freedom to start a new stage. The house, which had seemed empty for a long time, became a place where he felt comfortable. He began to decorate it with new things unrelated to the past. He bought several plants that would never have survived her care. He liked to take care of them himself. In the evening, he took the letter and carefully put it in the drawer where he kept the most important moments of his life. This letter was not a pain for him, but a symbol of what he had been through. It was no longer a burden. It became a bridge to a new life. With this realization, Ethan Carter began a new day. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.